Margaret Levi, and I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, known as CASBS. And I'm very happy to welcome you here to the first of 3 symposia that we do that bring people up to the hill who aren't normally here. A lot of the fellows are here as well. So there were announcements up there, and you'll get announcements since you've come here about the next 2. But I'm here to tell you about this one and a few things as well. So if you visit our website, you can get more details about our upcoming events of a whole variety of kinds, as well as our programs and projects. So I really encourage you to do that. And I also encourage those of you who don't have one to pick up our brand new brochure, which is an improved version on our old brochure. So updates it to the latest number of Nobels who've come through here. I also wanted to mention that this event is, I've got to read this because it's the first time I've done it this way. This event is sponsored by CASBS as part of the Ethics, Society, and Technology Hub at Stanford University. The Hub, which is a new presidential initiative, aims to stimulate, coordinate, and amplify projects and initiatives across institutes and centers on campus. I'm the co-chair of that with Rob Reish, who is also the director of the Center for Ethics and Society. And the idea is not to build a new center, but to really bring out what is happening at Stanford around issues that really consider the ethical implications and societal consequences of discoveries and advances in both technology and science. And so we have a 3-year remit to do this. And this is actually the very first event that is within the rubric of the Hub. There's another very big one happening next week with Jennifer Duda and Fei Li. And key to this whole endeavor has been Debra Satz, who is the Dean here of Humanities and Sciences and a former CASBS fellow, I'm proud to say, and was here when I was here so it's great to have her back. But she's really been very strongly behind this initiative to make sure that we have a kind of, if you will, cultural revolution at Stanford to really ensure that our students, our researchers, our affiliates, our alums, and our friends really begin to take seriously the ethical implications and societal consequences of what we do here. So Debra is going to moderate this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce our panelist.
So it's a pleasure to be here, although speaking as a dean, it would be even a greater pleasure to be here as a fellow, but such is life. So as Margaret said, I'm going to be moderating the panel tonight, and I thought I would start with a remark from one of the key initiators of the Human Genome Project, Walter Gilbert, who in 1992 claimed that, quote, "One will be able to pull a CD out of one's pocket and say, 'Here is a human being, it's me.'" I meant to have my phone with me so I could pull it out. So we're not there yet, and maybe we'll never be there, but there's no doubt that new technologies are putting pressure on, if not upending, the very idea of what it means to be human. Robots, while a long way from achieving all of the complex intelligence of our species, are making enormous progress in areas such as visual recognition. They're actually, self-driving cars are arguably much safer now than human drivers. Robots can also now cook you dinner, fill your medical prescriptions, lead yoga classes, and a Japanese robot, I just read about this tonight, even conducts Buddhist funerals. Our machines don't have minds yet, but they're taking on more and more of the attributes we used to think of as uniquely human: reason, action, reaction, language, logic, adaptation, and learning. Moreover, decision-making on key aspects of digital technology are being ceded to code-driven tools that most people don't even understand. So let's call this the black box problem. With respect to biological technologies, which we'll be talking about tonight, we now have the possibility of altering not only ourselves, but our descendants and our descendants' descendants, and ad infinitum. Here in Silicon Valley, enormous amounts of money are being invested to develop technologies that'll extend human life expectancy. And again, you can go on the internet and read blogs that see aging as a disease to be conquered. And other technologies are being invested in which aim at providing non-biological parts to humans. I was recently on a trip to Germany, and I met a scientist on a hike who had implanted an antenna in his brain so that he could receive radio signals, and pretty amazing. Now, since these technologies won't be offered for free, what are the implications of unequal access? So call that the inequality problem. Many of the changes that technology is bringing about are going to help us. Robots can take over boring and repetitive tasks. Technologies like CRISPR may be able to correct for genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis. But each of these technologies also carries risks. Nothing good in the world tends to come as an unalloyed good, so there are costs and benefits. Will robots take all the jobs? And if they do, what will happen to the humans who are out of work? As I mentioned, the ability to edit the human genome might further increase inequalities between the haves and have-nots. Is that a problem? And what should we do about it? Should we be worried about designer babies, bioweapons, and apps that know more about our health and identity than we do? Last year, I went to a talk where Yuval Harari pointed out that today's algorithms would be more able to identify him as gay long before he figured that out in his early 20s. So what should we think about issues like that? These are really important questions to consider because there's no single dimension on which to assess these. They're complex good and bad effects that we need to pay attention to, and all the dimensions of those good and bad effects. And we have two wonderful people to help us think about these questions and to put the issues in sharp focus. They're going to be zeroing in on reproductive technologies, although we'll also expand out. But because technology, as a term, is not what we philosophers call a natural kind, it's not that all technologies are exactly the same. They have raised different questions and different problems. We're going to use reproductive technologies as an example to in-depth think about these issues, and then we can step back and think, what are other kinds of questions that other kinds of technologies raise? We're going to be looking in our discussion not only at new technologies like CRISPR, but older technologies like in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, and screening for sex selection. Those are old technologies, but they raise ethical questions that we might be able to learn something from. Okay, so let me briefly introduce our panelists, who are both fellows at CASBS this year, she says with lots of envy. Alta Charo is the Warren Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin, author of over 100 articles, chapters in books, and government reports on topics having to do with law and policy about various kinds of biotechnologies. She's been on too many government panels and task forces for me to name. It would take all our time. So I'll just mention she served on Obama's transition team focusing on issues related to health and human services, the NIH, and the FDA, three arguably very important aspects of our government. She's also an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. She likes to play poker and read novels, and it will be fun to hear from. Rene Almeling is an associate professor of sociology at Yale, whose work focuses on the ways that our bodies and cultural norms interact, and thinking about that interaction with implications for scientific knowledge, how we market new medical technologies, and indeed how we live. Her 2010 book, Sex Cells, explored the medical market for eggs and sperm donors, and she's just finished a book with a fantastic title, Gynecology, G-U-Y, Gynecology, which argues that there's been insufficient attention to men's reproductive health. She's also the author of many articles, including original survey work on Americans' attitudes to genetic risk. Each of our speakers will speak for close to 15 minutes. Then we'll have some discussion up on stage among the three of us, again for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'll open it up for further deliberation, discussion with all of you. I'm looking very much forward to the panel, and please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
All right,
Great,
Rene.
thank you so much. Well, it is a real honor to be here with you today. How about in the back? Can you hear me in the back? Awesome. This is a historic location for us to be discussing some of the most pressing issues of our day. And that's a really high bar these days, right? With the sort of endless dire reports about global warming and political instability all around the globe, including here at home. But the issue of biomedical technologies and how they shape our humanity really deserves to be on that list. And I'm going to use my opening remarks to mention just a few of the reasons why I think that's the case. So as Debra mentioned, this term technology is very broad. So to ensure that we have some coherence to our remarks tonight, we're sort of focusing in on biomedical technologies, I would say, is maybe a slightly broader umbrella, and then on some of these issues in reproduction, how technologies have really changed how our species reproduces. So I'm a sociologist, and as a sociologist, I'm very interested in what technologies do, right? So not only in terms of how they work in and on the body, but what they do socially and politically and economically. How do biomedical technologies shape our family relationships, our friendships, our experiences in the workplace, and to use the language of Silicon Valley, scaling up? How do they affect our economies and polities, right? So this evening, we're also going to be looking at this question temporally and thinking about lessons from the past about what technologies have done and what we can learn from that, and then offering some very tentative predictions for the future so that we don't get ourselves in trouble about how today's technologies will shape tomorrow's humans. So one of the core features of our society, unfortunately, is massive inequality. And I know that that comes as breaking news to nobody in this room. We have economic inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality. And these intersecting inequalities really have to be a part of our conversation tonight, because innovation in the context of such deep and persistent inequality is really going to affect which technologies are made, how they are constructed, and then who has access to them. And that issue of access is crucial, and it deservedly receives a lot of attention, so I'm not going to talk too much more about that tonight. But it's not really the only form of inequality that I think we need to be concerned about when we're thinking about biomedical innovation. So I'm going to talk about two other ways that inequality matters when it comes to biomedical technologies. The first is that it's long been a defining feature of medicine that it focuses our attention down at the level of individual bodies. What is making this individual sick, and how can we fix it, right? And so it's in looking for answers to that question that biomedical researchers tend to look inside individual bodies, at their genes, or their hormones, or their organs. But researchers could just as easily focus on the many structural and social and environmental contributors to disease. The fact that people don't always have access to high quality healthcare, that they are breathing polluted air, drinking contaminated water, unable to access healthy food or find time and money to exercise, right? To offer just a partial list. But biomedical technologies tend to focus in on that individual level, and that focus on the individual occludes attention to these larger structural and environmental factors. So if I could wave my magic wand and reform the landscape of biomedical innovation in some fundamental way going forward, I would want to ensure that in addition to the important technologies that are being developed to cure individual bodies of particular diseases, I'm not saying that that's unimportant, but in addition to that, we would redouble and re-triple and re-quadruple our efforts to address those social and structural and environmental causes of ill health. Those are the kinds of efforts that improve the health of all bodies and reduce the need for expensive and invasive biomedical interventions after the damage has already been done. So I'm going to offer just one concrete example to sort of, bring our conversation with some examples. So pollution, right? This is not something that individuals can solve by shopping for the best organic food or flying in bottled water from some untouched spring in the middle of nowhere, right? Pollution is a collective problem, and it requires a collective solution with regulation and enforcement of those regulations. But of course, these are words that have not ever been popular in the United States and have lost even more traction since November 2016. So even as I am saying this and waving my magic wand, it's a really powerful magical wand, right? I don't really have a whole lot of hope right at this moment for this particular shift in the way that we're thinking. The second point that I want to make about inequalities and how they matter when it comes to biomedical technologies, I would argue is even less recognized than sort of this difference between individual versus structural foci. The individual bodies that I was just talking about are not generic humans, right? They are raced and classed and gendered and imbued with sexuality. They live in particular times, in particular places. And the process of making biomedical knowledge and developing new technologies often proceeds with a particular kind of body in mind. So for most of the 20th century, that was white male bodies. White male bodies were taken as the standard, and most biomedical research was conducted on middle-aged white men on the assumption that those results would just generalize to the rest of us. So our general knowledge about health and medicine, still to this day, is mostly knowledge about male bodies. And it really wasn't until the 1990s that women's health activists pressured the NIH to ensure that women were systematically included in biomedical research. So in contrast, the female body has been conceptualized and studied primarily as a reproductive body, right? A body that reproduces. And it's once you put these two assumptions side by side about the male as standard and the female as reproductive, that you can see how this leads to gaps in our knowledge about biomedicine and about human health. So I'm going to give you two examples of these two kinds of gaps, right? So first, we could think about heart disease in women. Historically, heart attacks were associated with stress, which was associated with masculinity and the workplace, and most of the research was on male bodies. So it wasn't until relatively recently that clinicians realized that heart attacks look different in women's bodies, right? And I think that gap is because heart attacks were studied in male bodies and not in women's bodies, because we were asking different questions about women's bodies, right? And then the second example I'm going to draw from the book that I just finished last week, so you're hearing it here first. This example is men's reproductive health, right? And usually when I say that phrase, people sort of cock their head and look at me and say, oh, did you mean to say that, right? And that's because we so profoundly associate reproduction with women's bodies that even the concept of men's reproductive health seems strange. And that's the point that I make in the book, right? That women's bodies have so long been the focus of biomedical knowledge making, of policy and technological development, that there's a major gap in our understanding of men's reproductive bodies. And it was about 15 years ago that this gap started to become very clear when research really started to reveal that men's age and their diet and their environmental exposures before conception could damage sperm and affect the health of their children. So doctors began arguing about 15 years ago that men too have a biological clock. And geneticists have now demonstrated that with every passing year, men are likely to have new mutations in their sperm that are associated with their children's risk of autism and schizophrenia. And that study made the front page of the New York Times. So now you can go on the Mayo Clinic's website and learn how to grow healthy sperm. You'll find out there that sperm can be damaged by a man's diet, being overweight, using tobacco, alcohol, or drugs, or being exposed to chemicals at home or work. So it turns out that all the things we tell women about pregnancy, right, not waiting too long and getting too old and watching every bite you eat and what you're exposed to, that this advice also applies to men until, and I would say to as some yet to be determined extent, because the research is still very new, during the 2 to 3 months that sperm grows in the male body. So that gap in knowledge is only more glaring if you think about the more than 150 years that we have asked every possible question about women's bodies and women's behaviors and how those affect reproductive outcomes. So the central question driving the book was what took so long, right? Why are we only now learning that men's health matters for reproductive outcomes? So don't feel bad if you didn't know that before I just said it. It's still news to most Americans and even many physicians, I will say. But this gap in biomedical knowledge about men's reproductive health is not only a missed opportunity to improve men's health and the health of their children, it also has ramifications for which reproductive technologies have been developed, right? There's still no male pill. And even after 100 years, there's been no new developments in male contraception. Condoms and vasectomies were available at the end of the 19th century. And that's in contrast to the many, 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 many new developments we have for women's contraception. When it comes to fertility treatments, most of these major technological developments still operate on and through women's bodies. The one possible exception here is ICSI, which is where if you can find one sperm, you can inject it directly into an egg, but that still requires the use of IVF, which happens in women's bodies. So if the male body is not thought of, if it's not conceptualized as reproductive, then we don't make knowledge about it. We don't make technologies about it. And I argue that there are huge spillover effects, right? Not only into reproductive politics, but into gendered politics and gendered inequalities more broadly. So I think this is part of the reason why groups of male legislators can enact bans on abortion and contraception with the idea that it has nothing to do with them, right? Because reproduction is women's business and it happens in women's bodies. Again, here's my magic wand. I'm going to wave it, right? So those in a position to be funding or evaluating, or actually making biomedical innovations, I would love if they would take a step back and really think about what kinds of social assumptions about bodies and bodily differences are driving how they do their work, right? Which research questions do they ask, and how do they go about answering them? So these various kinds of inequalities, the haves and have-nots in terms of access to biomedical technologies, the focus on individuals instead of structural and environmental factors, and this imbrication of social assumptions about bodies into the making of biomedical knowledge. All of these are being baked into today's technologies and will affect tomorrow's humans. Now I want to make just one last point, and then I will turn it over to my colleague. I want to be very, very clear that I'm not here as some Luddite who opposes technological development or new biomedical innovations, right? Instead, I think the social scientists and humanists among us who study science and technology and medicine really do so with an eye towards constructive criticism, to wanting to make the technologies better. Okay, thank you.
First, good evening. I'd like to reiterate the thanks. It's a real privilege to be here and to have support from CASBS and, in my case, from the Berggruen Institute as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Some of you may remember about a year ago, just about a year ago, that there was an announcement out of Hong Kong that there were 2 little girls who'd been born after their genomes had been edited at the embryonic stage. And the world met that news generally with horror. There were a few exceptions, but generally with horror at the idea that we were now able to tinker with human reproduction. We'll come back to that, I think, during the Q&A, because it was an amazing moment in Hong Kong for us. But I'd like to start by simply noting that a lot of emerging biotechnologies, particularly in the reproductive area, have been met repeatedly over the decades with the same set of concerns. And you could talk about them for your Hong Kong twins, or you could talk about them from the 1970s, amniocentesis, where you would first do karyotyping to see if there was an extra chromosome. That was the beginning of my laboratory experience, was karyotyping. The kind of concerns that you hear repeatedly would be that these technologies are going to change the nature of human relations, that parents will see their children as commodities that must be perfected and will reject them when they're imperfect. Fortunately, even with amniocentesis, even with the advances in cervical villus biopsies and now very simple non-invasive prenatal testing, to say nothing of being able to actually select embryos outside the body if you've diagnosed them as having mutations or not. With all of that, in fact, we've not actually seen parents stop loving their children or turn them into commodities or reject them when they're imperfect. And interestingly, we haven't even gotten less tolerant of people who, nonetheless, despite all these technologies, are born with these conditions. In fact, we've seen the Americans with Disabilities Act passed and then repassed during the same period of time in which we had greater and greater ability to actually avoid these very conditions. So I think the story here is more complicated than we think, but we hear the same concerns every time. We also hear a concern that we're going to change the nature of our species with this kind of technology, that genetic engineering is going to lead to the creation of enhanced human capacities, right? And we enhance ourselves all the time. All three of us are wearing eyeglasses that enhance us. If you have cataract surgery, they will give you a lens that gives you 20/20 vision in that eye. They're not going to give you a lens that replicates the bad vision you had all your life before the cataract. They'll enhance you, because why not? I mean, we're right there already, right? But it turns out that it's much harder to do this stuff than you'd want. You're looking at 3 height-challenged women here up on stage. You don't know this. They had to have a riser to help us crawl into these chairs. So you'd think that that would be an easy one. If I had kids, for sure I'd want them to be taller than me because they could reach the top shelf and get things down for me for the rest of my life. But it turns out there must be, 700 different genes that have some influence on your ultimate height, to say nothing of all the other effects of the environment and epigenetic changes, et cetera. So the concept of enhancement is actually far more complicated and far less realistic in many ways than we might think when we come to these kind of advanced technologies. We're doing a great job enhancing ourselves with low-tech technologies already. And we also see people complaining that, well, we're going to have kind of a genetic caste system with the genetic haves and the genetic have-nots, but those people forgot to take arithmetic in elementary school because population genetics says with 8 billion people on the planet, you'd have to change a lot of people before you'd see a noticeable change in the frequency of anything. So when I look at these technologies, having lived through these discussions, I find myself thinking, why are we talking about the same thing every time without actually paying attention to the evidence, right? Well, where is the evidence-based bioethics? But ignore what actually has been a repeated problem, because repeatedly these technologies, which often are very expensive, resource intensive, require sophisticated facilities and sophisticated training, are not available to large parts of the globe. Whether it's the less well-off in the United States or pretty much the entire Southern Hemisphere, a lot of these technologies simply aren't relevant to their lives. And we are not necessarily paying the kind of attention that we could. So my life's been consumed by genome editing, or CRISPR, for the last, 5 years, thanks to Jennifer Doudna, having gotten me and my colleague Hank Greeley, who's in here somewhere, right at the very outset, thinking about ethics and policy here. This offers a chance for us to rethink how we want to try to develop these technologies, right? Because it's once again being attacked. After the Hong Kong experience, once again, we're going to be doing something terrible to our species and our children. We also, how do you do this? We already have the Oviedo Convention in Europe, which would say that it's actually it's a violation of human rights to actually edit somebody, even if you're trying to prevent some terrible disease, that it violates human dignity. What this doesn't do is pay attention to the question of how we can actually do more for people by doing it differently. So instead of trying to do these kind of one-offs on each person's body, if we really want to improve the level of public health, It's not going to be through genome editing of our eggs and sperm. It's not even going to be through genome editing for somatic therapies to treat cancer and to treat retinopathies, which is now already in clinical trials with some very interesting results. And will certainly continue to develop. But the question is, if you really want to deal with public health, you get away from the bodies and you say, why are we not using this to advance genetic engineering of mosquitoes that carry dengue and malaria and Zika virus? We've already got a company using older forms of genetic engineering doing that, but people are terrified of it. In Florida, I know we got a few people here from Florida, there were demonstrations against using these engineered mosquitoes to try to prevent Zika from spreading and infecting pregnant women and leaving their children with devastating conditions. Instead, people felt more comfortable with what was familiar, which was dumping hundreds of pounds of pesticides into the air to fall on their heads and fall on their houses and fall on their lawns. But we could actually make enormous dents in insect-borne disease if we were to take full advantage of these technologies. We could be editing crops. I know I'm standing in California, which is simultaneously the Center for Biotechnology and the Center for Terror about GMO foods. It's a really interesting combination that you would have here. But we could be using this to enhance the nutritional value of foods, just like the golden rice, which had enhanced nutritional value, but got slammed through various kinds of public relations campaigns. We can help the health of farm workers by reducing the amount of pesticide they're exposed to, by continuing to develop crops that are naturally resistant to various pests, because we put a trait in there that makes the pests not like them very much. We could engineer foods so that we don't have to worry about contamination, and we don't have to use as many antibiotics to deal with contamination, which has led, we think, to this raft of antibiotic resistance that has been devastating us. I mean, just yesterday I was reading the numbers. I think it was 48,000 people per year dying from resistant infections and 3 million that are sickened by it. There was an incredibly large number. And we have a company right here in, I think they're now in Berkeley, that's growing real meat, not fake meat, real meat from cow stem cells. You don't have to kill the cow. You don't have to have fields of cows that are, pardon the language, but they're farting and putting methane into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas. You don't have to worry about killing animals. Instead, you can grow real meat in a totally safe environment. Amazing. Right? But we're not really focusing our attention there nearly as much. And when it comes to climate change, we could be creating crops that are more resistant to drought or more resistant to flood. We could be even trying to develop things like living skins for our homes that would react to temperature and to sunlight so that they naturally cool the house or keep the heat in the house without having to use electricity to power air conditioners and heaters. There's so many opportunities for us to be thinking more globally. The challenge is, how do you actually incentivize some of these things? And here's a very concrete example for you. Sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a disease that is one of the best targets for genome editing right now. But the technique that's being developed here in the United States, which we have great hopes for, is one that involves taking cells out of the body, then editing them, genetically engineering them, and then putting them back in the body where they'll now function better and relieve symptoms. Well, that's great, but think about the kind of equipment and personnel you need to do that. And yet sickle cell is most prevalent not here, but in parts of Africa where this is completely unrealistic, logistically and financially. So we have the Gates Foundation that has stepped up to put in money toward developing an in vivo system. You know, Star Trek fans, I'm a Star Trek fan. Star Trek fans remember Dr. McCoy and Beverly Crusher. They would just like press something. By the way, for those of you that are real Star Trek fans, that was an inverted salt shaker. Deep nerddom to know these things. They would press it against your arm and it would go, and it would, spit something into your body and suddenly your cells would all change. That's actually not a completely unrealistic concept in the future. And it's the kind of thing you would need to make something like the sickle cell therapy feasible in these countries. Our challenge is to figure out how to create a system for R&D and a market system for pharmaceutical development that would encourage these directions. Governments can prioritize their funding, although they are subject to the kind of pressures from patient groups that often drive them to body-specific, disease-specific kinds of approaches, which we see all the time at NIH. And the pharmaceutical companies invest gazillions for most things that fail in order to kind of get a hit at the end and make 2 gazillions to make up for what they lost in the failed drugs. And they get that by exclusive licensing and looking for blockbusters. So we need to think about new commercial incentive schemes that would allow us to provide people a reason to be pursuing things that would actually help us. Last, I have to acknowledge, I've got a colleague from CSAC sitting over there, that all of these technologies have a dark side to them. They can all be turned against us to make bioweapons or to have even just accidental releases that pose environmental risks. And we certainly need to have very good surveillance systems and regulatory systems to try and minimize those risks. But you'll never get them down to zero. And we know that we are not the kind of people who like to just turn our backs on technologies because of an irreducible risk. I mean, if you were to just invent fire right now, I think everybody in California would appreciate it's a mixed blessing, but nobody would say, let's do without fire. So it's a question about how you regulate and how you find the balance. I think that tomorrow's humans may very well be far better off than we are because of today's technologies, but I think individual medical treatment is only the beginning of what we could do to make those lives better. Thank you.
So great. So I'm going to just start with a few questions. So I wanted to ask you each about the role of the market in medical innovation. So obviously the market is an unbelievably powerful tool for innovation, but as you both pointed out, there are ways in which the market can be misaligned with the social good or public need. And so how much do you think we should turn over to the market? To what extent do we need other forms of intervention? To what extent should the public be directing medical innovation? So this is, I guess, a two-part question. Part one is on the role of the market, and part two is to what extent should public opinion play a role in regulation?
All right. Well, I'm going to take up the market and medical innovation question. And I think actually also one of your sort of concluding comments really poses a fascinating question, which is how would you actually incentivize innovation that would improve health for the most people in the most way, right? So if we were sort of going to try to quantify what it would take to actually improve population health, the answer is probably not a super high-tech pharmaceutical device that took 15 years to develop and is going to affect some small population of people with that particular disease. But the question of how to actually go about incentivizing innovation that would improve public health, you could turn a lot of these technologies into ways to reduce pollution, to improve the sort of cleanliness of the air, of water. Right now, Flint, Michigan, their solution was to sort of pass out bottled water for some number of years instead of actually figuring out a way to deliver water to the population that was not contaminated. So if we had the sort of, I guess when I often think about sort of genetic developments or technological developments, they're very sexy. They're very exciting. We are going to have the book of life and then we'll be able to read it and figure out, what's going to come. And I think if we could make population health and public health initiatives that are very technologically sophisticated, just as exciting to develop as some of these biomedical technologies that are expensive and only affect individual bodies. I don't have the answer for how to do that, but we're sitting in a place where people spend a lot of time thinking about innovation. And so maybe there's also going to be some comments from the audience about how to think creatively about that.
I suspect, too, that there's no single answer for this because we've had a lot of little efforts in focused areas. For example, talk about pharmaceuticals. There are markets that are not attractive because the business model doesn't make them attractive. The population doesn't have enough money to pay a high price for a drug to make up for the costs of developing that drug and the ones that didn't work. Or the population is very, very small. And that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue now that we've got more precision medicine identifying tinier and tinier slices of people who each need a slightly different kind of intervention so that you don't get the large market that gives you the returns. In those areas, we've seen some things tested. Both Europe and the United States have systems to give pharmaceutical developers a market advantage if they pursue these otherwise unattractive markets. They may get a longer period where they can sell their product without a lot of competition. Or for tropical diseases, they may get a special waiver that allows them, or a priority waiver that lets them get their product to the front of the FDA's very long regulatory line a little faster. But these things turn out to have unintended consequences. You see these waivers, these not being used to get a tropical disease to the front of the line, but they now go on the market and they're resold and sold to companies that simply want to get their next, let's say, blood pressure drug up to the front of the line, which is certainly not necessarily what would be most in the public's health interest, because we've got blood pressure drugs, and certainly doesn't help the tropical disease either. So one question is to take a look at the things we're already doing. The second area is to look at the politics about how we make the government decisions. Because, as I said earlier, the NIH responds, well, the NIH is funded by the Appropriations Committee from the Congress, and the Appropriations Committee is pressured by lobbyists, and the lobbyists are basically the patient groups. And they're far more sympathetic than anything else. I mean, you get somebody up there whose child is suffering from some terrible disease, and it is heartbreaking, legitimately, and that drives the kind of interest. So we don't necessarily have the kind of rational planning that you're imagining, even at the government level, because the system is different. And CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is probably the stepchild of the Health and Human Services Department. They're physically in Atlanta. Where's Atlanta? It's nowhere near Washington, D.C., so they're not at the table all the time, right? And they answer really like the FBI to all the things that didn't happen. All the times people didn't get sick because their peanut butter had fungus in it. All the times that they didn't wind up having cavities because the fluoride was in the water. So it's very hard to get people excited about the invisible gains. So those are areas where the question is, what kind of private-public partnerships can you use to try to create a new incentive system, like milestone payments for companies that pursue things that you have identified as an unmet need? There's no one solution for this innovation. The last thing I will say, though, and I can't remember who said it, but you can't necessarily try to do it all through central planning. Somebody once said that if we had done that for polio, we'd have the best iron lungs on the planet. There's a tremendous amount of serendipity in both biomedical individual science and also in public health. So genome editing, this incredibly fantastic way of being able to snip in and snip out or put in very specific changes that allow for very significant kinds of improvements in avoiding particular diseases and such. It started as research by the Danone company trying to figure out why some of their yogurt cultures failed and other yogurt cultures survived. Literally, that's it. And it was the bacteria in the yogurt that led to some of the basic science that led to the great Berkeley versus MIT patent wars over CRISPR. So there's a kind of need for basic science serendipity as well if you really want innovation.
So what about public opinion? Should public opinion play a role in setting priorities and directing pushing medical innovation in one way or another? Or is this an argument that public opinion is, misguided, gets us, focus on women's bodies, not men's bodies, would get us the iron lung, and so that's not the right way. The public doesn't have a role here.
You can't possibly say that the public doesn't have a role. The question is, how does it play that role, right? First of all, what's the public opinion? I've never seen anybody who's been able to get every single person's attitude, put into the system and then the little data generated. So I'm not sure what opinion we're talking about. Second, it's going to be distorted. This is why, people who are currently suffering from a disease will have a distorted vision about what it is that's important. And yet at the same time, there is room for kind of trying to test with the public those things that they value more. So there was an experiment in Oregon years ago, right, with Medicaid about asking people, how do you value, let's say, having a cavity filled? How do you value an organ transplant? How do you value having, acne? Whoa, I keep doing that. Acne medication. And it was interesting because it was useful to some extent when they're trying to figure out how to deal with a limited budget. On the other hand, the immediacy of something like a single kid who needs a liver tended to drown out 1 million Oregonians who would do better if their teeth didn't have cavities and they didn't have periodontal problems and they didn't therefore get infections that would lead, now we know, to heart disease.
Two things I want to say about public opinion, and one of them is that it's not as if the public is over here and the science and the technology are over here. The science and the technology is being made at a particular time and place with particular cultural values and norms. And so all of those seep in because the scientists are people, right? And they're part of a culture. So public opinion shapes science, and then science shapes public opinion. So I think it's very difficult to think about sort of putting them in separate boxes and saying the public opinion will just be an input into however we regulate science. So I think to sort of think about it more as a dynamic loop. And then the second thing I'll say is, having worked with some political scientists to do research on public attitudes towards technologies like genetic testing, there is a very, very well-developed finding in the political science literature that people, when confronted with technologies they don't understand, will fall back on their sort of partisan ideologies about government funding or government research. And so I think at the same time as it's really important for scientists and clinicians to do a lot of work to sort of explain what these technologies are, how they work, what are the actual risks, I think it's also very difficult for people to sort of keep up and offer really informed opinions. And then instead we get sort of Democrats saying, yay for more government spending, and Republicans saying, no, we don't want more government spending, regardless of what the technology is.
Great. So I wanted to ask you, both of you pushed a kind of inequality line as the one important dimension of thinking about technologies, and downplayed a kind of cultural change perspective. So the idea that reproductive technologies haven't really undermined parental love for children. Really what we should be focusing on is not so much this idea that the social fabric will be fundamentally changed, but that we should look at questions of who has access to these technologies. And I'm very sympathetic to the underscoring of inequality. Lots of my work is on this. But I want to push you each a little bit on the kind of sidelining of the cultural and relational effects. And so I had a colleague years ago, Peter Gallison, who studied the debates of the atomic bomb and scientists debating the atomic bomb. And there were incredibly sharp moral problems posed by the development of the atomic bomb, particularly this idea about a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, which is central to just war theory, and the development of the atomic bomb made it impossible to hold on to that distinction. By the time the hydrogen bomb was developed, those questions were gone. So nobody, debated anymore about whether directly killing non-civilians was a problem. So in some ways, it fundamentally reshaped the way people thought about the ethics of war. And so I'm wondering whether we should learn from that some kinds of technical innovations can bring some questions to the fore, but blind us to the importance of other distinctions that we might want to hold on to.
Yeah, I think, well, as we were sort of talking about what we were going to focus on in this panel, one of the conversations that Alta and I had was to think back 50 years ago, right? So if we put ourselves in 1970, and what is the state of reproductive technologies at that point? So in the United States, at least, abortion is not yet legal. The pill for women had very recently become available to married couples. And so and IVF was had not yet successfully been done. So if you sort of think back in the specific context of reproductive technologies 50 years ago, and the ways that those technologies have really shifted women's in particular, but families' ability to decide if and when they're going to have children, and are they going to go get an education first and then have children later, for unwanted pregnancies to be able to access abortion, if you can't get pregnant, to use IVF and some of these other technologies, of course, as long as you have money or insurance to do it. But that's a fundamentally different world world than the one that we live in now. And so that was where we sort of had thought about, oh, are we going to try to project out 30 years from now, and how are technologies going to shape, people's everyday lives? I think it's very difficult to make predictions like that. But I think the thing that will be true is that it will have some enormous effect on cultural norms that are associated with gender and class and race, because that has stayed true. That change has been constant.
And I would not suggest that these technologies don't, in fact, have these kinds of cultural shifts. I'm not so sure, though, that that's necessarily worrisome. I mean, I think that you're constantly seeing changes in cultural norms. It's inevitable. I even think it's desirable. And we've seen it over and over again. When you bring in television and automobiles, suddenly people have a sense of the wider world and the ability to get there. And it changes patterns of people's family lives. Families are separated more than they used to be. That changes elder care. It changes care for the grandchildren. It also changes our notions about the value of owning a house, which used to be the biggest and best thing you could possibly do. But in an economy where you want people to be mobile, maybe renting is now the best thing to do because people are thinking more mobily. And science, technological changes will be hard to predict. I mean, when you've got something like the genome editing that I'm obviously obsessed with, you've now got a technology that is easier to do with less sophisticated facilities and less sophisticated training than the earlier forms of genetic engineering. So what we're doing is we're decentralizing science. And it's like what happened when YouTube came in and suddenly everybody could make a video. You didn't have to get a Hollywood producer to make a video for you, or a television producer. So you had lots more voices, lots more opportunities, and a lot of real garbage. Similarly, science is being decentralized with things like genome editing, or here on campus with Drew Endy, BioBricks, in which, just like when you hook things up now, the plugs all fit into one another, they're all standardized. He's talking about standardized biological units. You want to build a centerpiece for your dinner party? Fine, just take 3 things off the shelf, put them together, and you grow your centerpiece. 3D printing, et cetera. These are going to make us more independent. It will change things. But is that bad? I don't know that that's bad.
But not all change is bad, but clearly I think arguably the loss of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants is a not good change, and some changes might not be good. And, of course,
Right.
it's very hard to predict what direction things are going in, but we should be, anticipating. Nobody anticipated that Facebook would challenge the stability of democracy,
Right. Mm-hmm.
but it would be a good thing if we were able to think those things
Right.
through more.
I mean, and I take your point about the combatant, non-combatant, because you picked probably the most dramatic example you could think of. But I'm a law professor, and so I read these endless Supreme Court decisions. There was one quite a while ago now, Lawrence versus Texas, and they were looking at a law that made homosexual behavior criminal. And what was really interesting about this particular case is that the court didn't go in and say, was the problem that it was discriminatory? Was the problem that somehow gay people should or should not be considered a particularly vulnerable population politically, et cetera? There was a really dramatic statement that it simply isn't the business of the state to try and create and enforce the dominant view about morality. It's not the role of the state. So it said the state had no legitimate interest. Without a legitimate interest, none of its rules were going to be able to be upheld. That case has not been followed as generously in spirit as I might have hoped after that case. But jurisprudence is complex, obviously. But it tells me that when we talk about these kinds of shifts, I think you need to have you need to use a scalpel as opposed to an axe when it comes to figuring out what needs to be corrected because it got out of control after a techno change shifted the way people behave.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll just add that, I'm less sort of focused on whether it's good or bad than one of the things that I wanted to point out, that has really not changed, even as there's so many different ways to create families and have children and not have children, is that we still have such an intense focus on biogenetic relatedness, right? So many of these genetic technologies that Alta has mentioned are really predicated on the fact that people want to have their own biological children, preferably in their own bodies. And that is sort of a mainstay, a cultural norm that really hasn't budged too terribly much, even as there are all kinds of family forms having all kinds of relationships that are now called family, but that one really hasn't changed. And so maybe that's when I would say will probably still be with us 50 years from now.
And if I may, actually picking up exactly on that, how many people here remember the Jetsons? Excellent. I love talking to people that are my age. So I actually had the occasion recently because of a conversation with Ruth Levine about the Jetsons, and I went back and was watching an early episode and then watching the discussion with the developers of the Jetsons. And it's really interesting. This is the very futuristic world in which you have flying cars and you've got robots that are making your food and walking your dog, except the Jetsons' wife is still prancing around in a little cocktail dress. And the Jetsons' teenage daughter is still boy crazy staring at her video screen, which then seemed very futuristic. Whereas the Jetsons' father is the one who goes off to work. And even the robot maid was a maid, female, with a little apron. So there are these cultural norms that are very sticky that will probably take a long time to shift no matter how many technological innovations you throw into the mix.
Great. So now I want to thank you. Now I'd like to open it up for questions from people. Yeah, go ahead.
Microphone.
What?
Are you calling on people?
Yes, I'll call on people.
A very quick note. I think methane comes out of the front end of cows, not the back end, or so I've heard. I've never checked it. The individual versus the large community, does this give China or other cultures an advantage in some of these applications of technology?
You've been to China more recently.
Yeah. Yes, I think it does. I think it does. But not only because there may be a different philosophy about individualism versus collective good and the relative balance between those things, and the degrees of individual freedom that may or may not be consistent with a larger vision, but because of two things: the incredible centralization of authority there, coupled with the incredible enforcement power of the state. Those two things mean that there can be a decision taken about what is in the best interest, and it can be enforced. It does allow for the kind of prioritization and rational thinking that we might all wish that we had at the level of the federal budget, but it runs the risk of a single decision which may not be the best decision, not only being terrible for everybody, but particularly oppressive for some.
And I think you don't even have to go to China to find evidence that countries can make decisions about investing in the public good. So in the United States, we spend more healthcare dollars for more terrible outcomes than most other developed countries. And much of Europe has a much stronger safety net that is part of why their population is healthier and better off, is because they invest in population health in a way that we don't.
Other questions? Yeah, back there.
So this question is mostly for Alta, but would love if Rene saw anything interesting to jump in. So it has to do with regulation. So your argument seems to assume that the possibility of a rational basis for regulation. Because, especially if you want to get into very innovative, risky technology, you do need to rely on smart regulators. So in the past, I think that not a lot of people ever trusted politicians, but we kind of tended to trust the technicians, the government scientists, blah, blah, blah. That, I think, has come to an end, right? So the NEA, the CDC is not studying anymore the impact of environmental change on disease and blah, blah, blah. I don't know what's happening at the FDA, but I would say that there is a deep distrust at this point, I mean reasonable rational distrust in the government as a source of regulation. So, a couple of questions. How do you think that we can rebuild the trust? If it's worth doing it, should we think about different ways of coming up with regulation, like citizen science regulation, trust the lawyers and tort law to do that? Whatever. So, what is the future of regulation? Because otherwise, I don't see how we can trust policies about CRISPR or anything else.
So I've done my time in government. I worked for Congress in the 80s, and I worked for the executive branch in the 2000s, and spent a lot of time with the myriad advisory committees for the national academies and for the Clinton administration. And throughout that period of time, we did see a kind of steady drop-off in confidence in so-called experts. True. I blame the 1960s. I blame the demonstrations against the government, which was lying about the Vietnam War, giving us a generation of baby boomers who have a higher level of skepticism, particularly about government and government experts even, than we might have had in the previous, let's say, World War II and Korean vet era generation. But I also know that in the United States, we've historically seen waves. I mean, in the 19th century, we actually had a party called itself the Know Nothing Party. I'm waiting for them to come back. So part of me simply has trust that at some point this is going to be self-correcting. Part of it is that we actually have seen one change in the last 15, 20 years, I think, in the way in which policy is being done at pretty much every place I've been in government. You hear the word transparency over and over and over again. And a lot of that is simply about making it possible for people to actually know what the discussion is about, who's at the table, what their conflicts of interest might be, and how they came to their decisions with their rationales laid out. Now, that can go to an extreme. I mean, we just saw an announcement of a proposed rule that would make it impossible for EPA to use classic studies on things like arsenic and lead and mercury, because now you couldn't use a study if the underlying health data was not completely transparent, which would mean violating the privacy of all those people who were studied, people who'd been promised privacy. So we're running into kind of problems. Transparency is not an easy thing. And plus, a lot of times, decisions cannot possibly be made in the view of everybody because there's too much personal political loss by admitting that you really want to compromise. But nonetheless, this kind of idea that sunshine is the best disinfectant has really taken hold. And I think that over time, that may be one of the keys to restoring some degree of confidence.
Yeah, over here.
Well, one constant that seems to endure is the defense spending in public fears of another. That's a great incentivizer that works with science. How does it play out in the future for the biotech world?
This is you too.
Well, it's very difficult to seriously try to answer that question because you have here in the audience somebody who actually ran the special part of the Defense Department that focused on thinking about innovation and the future and had a particularly strong interest in biotechnology. But certainly there's lots of examples in which military applications have then become profoundly important in the civilian sector. I think pretty much everybody here probably has an iPhone, maybe an Android, but they're all based upon technology that was developed originally for the military. Now in the biotechnology area, there's really interesting work going on, for example, in how to enhance the resistance that our service people have if they are confronted with some kind of biological threat. Is there something you could give them that would temporarily increase their resistance that could then be reversed? This would be epigenetic changes. You don't change the gene, but you change how strongly the gene expresses. And if that becomes workable in the military context where the risk-benefit balance is clearer because the risks are so much more substantial, it paves the way to developing something that might actually be incredibly useful in the face of a civilian population that suddenly has a measles outbreak. And now we have a way of intervening quickly to enhance resistance to something that's very current. So, yeah, defense spending is enormous, and I am not an economist, and I'm not a specialist in federal budget making. So I have no comment on that. But I do think that there is a tremendous amount of crossover and civilian value that we ultimately get out of this.
So I want to pick up on this, though, and take it, I think, in a direction you weren't taking it. But, a lot of innovation comes from an initial investment by government, but then is reaped, the rewards are reaped by private companies. So the public puts in a lot to, research at places like Stanford or universities or, that are really pushing the science forward, but then it's captured, I would say some of the benefits are captured by private companies. So how should we think about that?
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is it's a classic symptom of American capitalism. And so there was a recent example of this where the government had actually funded the development of an AIDS drug and then had let the patent go. And activists were the ones who sort of figured this out and reclaimed it. And so now this is now under, being litigated. But I think that these examples of companies taking advantage of government dollars is a broader symptom of a much broader problem.
And even here, it gets really complicated. So 1980 in the biotech area is really a signal moment because that's when suddenly, if a university investigator was using government money to develop something that was patentable, the patent would be held by the university and the investigator, not by the government. And what you see then, you're setting it up now for this possibility that then a private company comes in later and capitalizes on it and prices it out at a point where nobody can get it. On the other hand, take a look at the number of patents that were filed and patents that were actually then licensed, because you need to get it licensed and developed for it to have any real value. The discovery is just the discovery. And you see this tremendous uptick after this innovation. So what you want to think about is maybe a slight correction as opposed to just an attack generally on that. For example, I'm not a patent person, so I'm sure there's some patent lawyers here, but it's always been odd to me that we have so much exclusive licensing where you might have some way of having non-exclusive licensing that would at least create a somewhat more competitive market if it is something that was originally developed with public monies. Or there can be some public-private partnerships where there's certain discounts that are made available. And I know that the current deputy director at the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs was working on that when she was at the White House. So I do think that there are tweaks that would bring these things back to a usable point for the public without necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I was going to take the military question in a slightly different direction. I think because some of those early innovations are happening in the military and are basically being tested on soldiers, one of the early canaries in the coal mine for men's reproductive health was men's exposures to Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, where all of a sudden they came back and they started having children with various kinds of birth defects. And so there was a number of studies that were done. The March of Dimes got involved. The VA was involved. There was a lot of work to try to figure out, was there a direct connection between these soldiers' exposures to this to these chemicals on the battlefield and the fact that their children were having health problems. And in the end, I think the final sort of consensus is that they couldn't actually prove that that was the thing causing the problem. But it led to a number of questions about men working in factories where they were manufacturing batteries or making pesticides. So those were, in the 1970s, there were some of these hints that men's bodies were actually not invulnerable and could be affected by what they were exposed to. And the military is one place where that happened. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier getting the public You mentioned earlier getting the public voice into the discussion. It seems now that the public voice is very heavily shaped and by social media, which is very, very heavily manipulated by marketing services and agencies. Academia and government science has traditionally been horrific at actually using some of those tools to manage the public perception. Do you see that changing? Otherwise, it's minnows against sharks.
Yes. Well, I think there's I would say that there is a sense that it is not our job. I'll speak for myself as an academic. It's not my job to sort of shape public opinion. I conduct research, I interview people, I ask them about what meaning and experiences they've had with egg donation or sperm donation or various kinds of technologies. And I want to make that available to a broader public, but I don't actually see it as my job to go and shape the narrative in the way that a company has an incentive to shape the narrative, or government agencies might be making decisions about who has access to what. So I think it's probably more of a mentality in terms of like what we think our job is. And there's certainly efforts. There's various networks put together of scholars to try to bring our voices into the debate. But I would say it's probably not something we're trained to do.
I actually think there's growing interest among scholars in trying to get their voices out. Not so much to manipulate the public in any way, but the public's understanding of science is at a really low level, and I think people are recognizing that they can't even do their science. It won't be funded, it won't be supported unless the public really understands what the benefits of this science are and some of the basic facts. So there's a lot more interest in science journalism, and a lot of our PhDs are now thinking about how to write op-eds.
But you've got companies here that are very influential in this because for a long time, if you put in, erectile dysfunction into your web browser, you'd come up with a whole host of completely phony baloney things before you'd ever actually get to a legitimate drug. And this was true for all kinds of diseases. And, you can work with a company that has a huge market share in terms of internet searching like Google. But there's only a few companies. That kind of economic concentration means we're incredibly dependent on them to try to very cleverly work with us to figure out how to make sure that the bad stuff doesn't rise to the top. First of all, who decides what's the bad stuff? Second, how do you figure out how people are getting it in there? I mean, they've all got their keywords and their algorithms and their tricks. So I don't know that there's actually going to be an answer to this. It used to be that the First Amendment theory was that, more speech is the answer to bad speech. But now we've got such a cacophony that I'm not sure that anybody's hearing anything anymore.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I think an underlying theme of a lot of this discussion is these kind of competing dystopian and utopian visions of how technology will either introduce or solve all these problems related to our bodies and our society and our health. And I think another interesting object to think with that ties in with a lot of these themes is virtual reality. And this idea that, we know that now there's you can buy a headset for less than $200, so it will be more popularized. And when I think back to a lot of the kind of early rhetoric when it was first being introduced was, essentially this idea that you could just download your consciousness into this thing, and then we wouldn't have to worry about all the problems associated with the body, our environment or climate change or aging. And so in a way, it's almost a more kind of crystallized form of a lot of the ideas that you're talking about, because you can solve the problems of the body, but you don't even have to worry about the body, itself. So I guess I'd just be curious to hear if you had any thoughts about how virtual reality might kind of tie in with some of these discussions and themes.
You're the body girl.
My response as I'm listening to you describe this is at some point you take them off and then you are still there, right? If you're part of the machine, yeah. I think this is one of those moments where we can say technologies too are part of our societies. And so it's why in vitro fertilization didn't massively change how parents and children relate to each other. It was sort of a technology that was developed and then got knitted into existing social, cultural, political, economic structures. And I think it's the reason that so many of us that we focus so much on inequality is because that part of how technologies are developed, or who is going to have access to them, that part remains so powerful. And I think it would be just as true if we were talking about who's going to have the VR and who's going to be able to download, and all of this. And so I think, coming back to this, we often have this idea that technology is going to change everything, but technology is produced and comes into a world that already is shaped in so many ways that are also going to shape that technology.
Yeah. Okay. Last question.
Been a great discussion, thank you. I'm always struck by the real unknowingness of technology. We don't know what technologies are coming, even in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And we certainly don't know their implications. If you look at why people lived so much longer in the 20th century than they did in the 19th century, it wasn't that doctors improved, they sure did, or pharmaceuticals improved, or with sulfa drugs or penicillin. It was very simple. It was because of better sanitation and clean water, sewage systems, things like that. But at the time when those started to get put in the 1880s and afterwards, nobody was thinking that this will cause people to live longer. They were just saying it'd be nice to have proper clean water. And I'm also thinking you can't really optimize the control of technology or the regulation. When the automobiles came along in Europe, or here around the 1900s, there was a lot of consternation about horses being frightened, people getting run over. And in Britain, at least, they had a red flag law that a man, and was a man, with a red flag, needed to walk in front of each car. And this sounds ridiculous now, but my reflection, I'd love to get your comments on this, is it's probably a good idea because nobody knew how that technology was going to work out. In other words, this sort of crossing the river by feeling for stones, to borrow a Chinese expression. We don't know what we're doing. Regulation can't be optimized. We don't see what the effects are going to be. So we should proceed with a certain amount of caution, feeling our way.
Well, there are different ways to approach regulation. And it does take some thought about picking one at the outset with the technology. I'm going to call it red light, green light, yellow light. We have green light where, for example, if somebody comes up with a new food and it has components that we generally recognize as safe, it goes on the market. And we have to wait for a problem to develop before any regulatory action is taken. That's a green light system. It gets stuff out in the market fast. Lots of people test it. Lots of people use it. The problems come up. And if you're lucky, if you're surveilling properly, you can see the problems. And then you have to pull back. And the problem is people get hurt along the way. Red light systems, like the one we have for new pharmaceuticals or for certain kinds of pesticides and chemicals, are ones where you can't get into the market until somebody's given you an okay. And this can be an enormous bottleneck. It can cost tremendous amounts of money to get through that approval process. It has a real squelching effect on smaller actors and gives preference to the kind of repeat actors that know how to develop these things. But far fewer people get hurt once it's really out there because you've had more testing and more vetting. What we don't have a lot of in the United States is a yellow light system that allows for a higher degree of control once something's on the market, but still lets it out on the market in, let's say, smaller amounts or to a more limited population where you're going for wider and wider degrees of testing with a kind of iterative regulatory approach. And we really don't have that baked into many of our statutory schemes. And unfortunately, for the moment, it's unrealistic to think we're going to change those statutes and pass new legislation. But when we get to the point where we do, it's really worth sitting back and asking, can we come up with something that gives us a more subtle level of control, at least for those technologies whose clearly toxic risks are not so immediate that we must have complete clampdown control on them.
I was going to say, the question came from our resident expert in complexity economics, from whom I have learned that the way that you make new technologies is to build from the building bricks of previous technologies. So maybe we just need to figure out what are the possible bricks that we're even talking about to what comes next. And so I'm going to put that back on you.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel.
you.